Hey friends, it's Allison here, jumping in real quick before you get into all the juicy details of today's episode. Did you know there is just one more week left to our 200th episode giveaway where you have the chance to win a full ride scholarship to the Better Belly Blueprint? This is the way to heal your gut so that you can poop daily, ditch acid reflux, and balance your hormones even when nothing else has worked. Here's how you can enter. Leave a rating and review on the Better Belly podcast on Apple Podcast or Spotify between now and May 29th. Take a screenshot of that rating and review, then go to betterbellytherapies.com/giveaway and fill out our 200th episode giveaway form. You will automatically receive an email with a code for $200 off the Better Belly Blueprint, which you're going to get as soon as you send in that form. And then a full scholarship winner is going to be announced on May 30th and messaged by email. If you win, you're going to win a full scholarship to the Better Belly Blueprint. And if you don't win, you can still get $200 off, which is 20% off of the Better Belly Blueprint if you join by May 31st at midnight. So go ahead and leave a rating and review. Get that giveaway form filled out at betterbellytherapies.com/giveaway, and you can finally end your constipation, acid reflux, and PMS for good. Have you ever had a question you wished was answered on the Better Belly podcast? Have you ever heard us talk about a topic you wanted to hear on, but then maybe we didn't quite answer it to the level of detail that you wanted? Or have you ever just wanted someone to give you a little bit of overview on your health history and get some guidance on what might be holding you up in your health? If so, I am so excited to be announcing a new feature on the Better Belly podcast, Ask Allison episodes. Ask Allison episodes are all about featuring you and your questions on a single episode so that I can help you get answers you are looking for and probably help a couple other people along the way. On today's first Ask Allison episode, we will be discussing a question I received on the gut-allergy connection and how childhood allergies are connected to the gut. By the end of today's episode, you'll understand a little bit more about how you can help your environmental allergies to things such as pollen and actually reduce your allergies without needing to use pharmaceuticals by looking into your gut and your childhood. And we'll also be talking about something we haven't yet done so on the podcast, ear infections. And if that does not sound interesting to you, I beg you, hold on. They are a fascinating topic for our podcast. I am so excited to bring you this multifaceted episode. And if you'd like to hear a question of yours answered on the podcast, I'll also be sharing by the end of the episode how you can submit your own question and possibly be featured in an upcoming episode. Are you guys ready? Let's jump in. Welcome to the Better Belly podcast, where we find freedom from food restrictions, we increase energy in our lives, and we begin to feel more healthy and vibrant than ever by finding the root causes of our health problems. My name is Allison Jordan. I'm a marathon runner, functional medicine health coach, certified craniosacral therapist, gut health nerd, lover of Jesus, and owner of Better Belly Therapies, a clinic based in Ann Arbor, Michigan that works with both virtual and local clients to help them achieve the best health of their life. I am here to walk with you on your journey to a better belly and a better life. We're going to go beyond popping a probiotic and just checking out our poop. In this show, we are going to go deep into gut transformation strategies that last for your entire life. If you are ready to feel your best, get ready to roll. You are in the right place. And just as a reminder, this information is not meant to diagnose, manage, or treat disease. Always consult with your own health practitioner before you make any changes to your health.
Hi, Allison. I am wondering if you can speak more about the connection between gut and allergies, specifically environmental allergies. I've had environmental allergies to pollen since I was a kid, and I also had pretty frequent ear infections as a kid. I would get an ear infection every summer for 6 summers, I think, total. And so I'm just wondering how I developed these allergies, because it's not normal, right, to be allergic to pollen. Well, maybe it's normal now, but shouldn't be, at least in my opinion. So that's my question, is the connection between the gut and environmental allergies.
All right. Well, this question comes in from an anonymous sender, and he used it through our new program, SpeakPipe, which is available on our website, betterbellytherapies.com/ask Allison. And so if you're wondering how we got somebody else's voice on here, that is how we did it. It's a pretty cool device, and I'll describe a little bit more at the end of the episode, how you can also record your own question here. But this is a great question, and I actually have already answered a chunk of this in another podcast episode. And so if you are listening to this and you're like, oh my gosh, I want to know the answer too, I would encourage you, if you have not already, check out my podcast episode 47, the gut sinus connection, and episode 45, the gut skin connection. And we'll have both of these linked in the show notes. But in both of these episodes, I do a deep dive in how the gut drives and can often worsen allergies and sensitivities that show up in our sinuses and on our skin. This is mainly done through the mediation of the liver. And so if you've never heard that before, definitely check those episodes out. It will clarify some confusion, or at least some maybe like lack of science-y background that people may or may not be talking about on why the gut and sinuses and skin are all connected, and also why a lot of times allergies, whether it's chemical sensitivities or environmental sensitivities or skin sensitivities, can worsen over time, and it has to do with the liver. So there is a component of the microbiome that is important, but it's really how the microbiome then affects the liver that is the biggest factor in how allergies, both the chemical, environmental, show up or honestly don't show up in someone's body. But this question was a little bit different. And one thing I wanted to dive into from it was specifically, where do childhood allergies come from? Because I definitely cover allergies and sensitivities in the episode 47 and 45, which again, if you haven't checked it out, strongly recommend doing that. But childhood allergies, it's kind of like, well, I haven't been living very long to how did I end up this way? Not everyone has childhood allergies. Sometimes one sibling will have it, the other one won't. Although there tends to be some commonalities within a family unit of having allergies. And so specifically when it comes to childhood allergies, I will say this is a very big question. In general, we don't have this like, everybody agrees and knows that this is where environmental allergies come from. I mean, if that was the case, then I don't know, hospitals would have this thing on like, we have the cure to allergies. Unfortunately, not everyone agrees on where they come from or how they come about, but this is going to be from a functional approach, what we understand on childhood allergies and why some people have them and some people don't. So there's two main factors I want to keep in mind, or two main kind of frameworks to keep in mind when you're asking like, where did my childhood allergies come from? So number one is going to be birth and childhood factors. And what do I mean by that? I mean, how were you born? Was it vaginal or cesarean birth? Were you breastfed or bottle fed? Did you have any signs of GI disturbances as a child, such as colic, spitting up, being a picky eater? Did you have, were there any fetal development factors that you know about, such as, did your mother have GI problems? So like basically when you were in the fetus when you were in your mother's womb, what was going on with your mother? What was going on? Like, was she constipated? Did she have, what was her diet like? Did she eat a wider variety of foods, or was she maybe so nauseated she couldn't? Everybody is different, and this is not about mother shame or kind of blaming our parents or anything, because our childhood, for many of our listeners, is in our past, but it's something to keep in mind of what happens. So when you're born vaginally versus cesarean, there's different bacteria or microbiome that are or are not passed between mother and child. Being breastfed, especially even just like getting some initial breast milk when we're born, that is called colostrum. That contains a lot of bacteria and prebiotics and probiotics and immune system, like antibodies, that really jumpstarts a baby's life, as well as just the breast milk over time. And there's definitely been some decades, I'd say, especially the second half of the 1900, or yeah, the second half of the 20th century. That was hard to say, guys. So from like 1950, 2000 range, being bottle fed was highly recommended. It was considered better in some ways, and now we're kind of realizing it wasn't. So there's still a lot of people who might be breastfed or bottle fed versus breastfed even in our current decades. And that can really impact gut development and having a healthy microbiome, which will then impact the liver. And that will make a lot more sense if you listen to episode 47 on the gut sinus connection. Why do I care about the liver so much? So that's fetal development factors. Again, like, what were you exposed to in the fetus? And you might not know 100%, but it is a good opportunity if you want to, if you have access to asking your mother, asking your parents what they remember about either your being in utero, like did your mother have to take any antibiotics while she was pregnant with you? There's just all sorts of different factors that can predispose a fetus to having problems. And if you're kind of like, I've never heard this before, there's some really interesting research on how a mother's microbiome can affect her fetus's microbiome. One of them being actually having to do with periodontal health. And so there's a lot of research out there that has to do with looking at how a mother's bacteria in her mouth, can we find that impacts the baby? And they've actually found that women with, for example, periodontal disease, so negative or pathogenic bacteria in the mother's mouth, that same periodontal bacteria, so that's mouth bacteria, will actually be found in the baby. It'll be found in the cord. I'm blanking what it's called. You would think I'm pregnant right now. I'm thinking about all these other words here right now, not pregnancy related, but it's in the cord of blood between the baby and the mother. And so things that you would think are like, oh, the mouth is so far away, are actually impacting us even as we are growing in our mother's womb. And so just consider birth and childhood factors playing into your body's development of its immune system and how well your liver was developing and was your liver burdened. Other things to keep in mind when it comes to liver burden is, were you exposed to heavy metals? Was there stuff in your water that maybe chemicals or microplastics, things like that would end up burdening your body, and it would affect you not only in your childhood but in your ongoing years, which is something that we keep in mind when we work with our clients and we say, hey, look, you've had IBS or bloating or constipation for most of your life, or maybe recently it's onset, but there's been a slow buildup over time leading you to this point. And what were all those buildup points? Were there exposures to, what type of toxins were there exposures to? And then once the body becomes burdened from that, it cannot handle kind of normal irritants like pollen and dust nearly as well. And so that's how you get this like child who just massively reacts to these things. Then there's other growing up factors. So things that after you're born and after you're very, very young, were you given antibiotics for any reason? In this question here, from this question on SpeakPipe, he asked about an ear infection. So it's like, were you given antibiotics for that ear infection repeatedly? Did you have any concussions? We know that concussions actually impact the microbiome. What was your diet like? Did you eat lots of processed foods, natural foods? Did you have any food sensitivities that you were exposing yourself to that you now know, like, oh, I know now that I shouldn't eat gluten, but I was eating gluten my entire childhood? That is massively going to cause inflammation inflammation in the whole body, and that will show up in places like the sinuses and in the immune system, and again, will predispose you to have this really intense reaction to relatively mild irritants, which is the environmental factors. Like pollen and dust are irritants, but they're not designed to make us just like swell up like balloons or things like that. So, those are what I would consider when it comes to childhood allergies. Like, why did you get childhood allergies? And that's honestly not even everything, but you really want to consider, those would be some of the things that I'd be considering. And I really would, I already said this several times, you guys check out episode 47, the gut sinus connection, because I go into much more depth on that whole liver and gut and inflammation and toxicity and what's going on and why this is all connected and how it shows up in the sinuses. And honestly, some of the signs and symptoms of a burdened liver, because other than your doctor saying, oh, your liver enzymes are a little off, there's a whole myriad of other symptoms and signs that can go with a burdened liver. And I talk about those all on episode 47. But what I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about on today's episode is ear infections, because this is not something we've discussed on the podcast yet. And it's not inherently connected to allergies, but they can be. And so there's two big things that I wanted to talk with you guys about on ear infections. Number one, ear infections are more common in children because of a natural structural development and change that happens in the head, but doesn't happen typically before adolescence. And this is something to do with a structure in your head called your eustachian tube. So your eustachian tube is a kind of little channel in the head that links the inner ear with basically the back of the throat. And it's designed to drain fluid from the ear to the throat so we can then swallow it and the ear stays nice and dry and you don't get infections, right? Well, when we are born, our eustachian tubes are flat typically. So it's just part of the fact that when we're born, all of our cranial bones aren't molded to, or aren't all formed together. There's that fluidity of babies' heads. So we're careful with their heads. We know their heads grow a lot. Our brains grow a lot. Our mouths grow. We get teeth. There's all these amazing things that happen. And eustachian tubes are one of them. So people or children in general are going to get more ear infections. And then some children will get them more than others. Sometimes children will actually have eustachian tubes that are not just horizontal or flat. They'll actually kind of be retrograde. So they'll go backwards. So they actually keep fluid inside of the ear. And oftentimes those children might get ear tubes, which I actually did. Sometimes eustachian tubes are just extra narrow. And so it really makes it hard for fluid to come out and drain out. And that's another reason that you might get these ear tubes or inner ear tubes to help your ear drain fluid until the eustachian tube develops. So that's super normal aspect of things. What we want to be looking at is what is abnormal. So, in this question, you said that you had, or our question asker said that you had ear infections for about 6 summers. And I just wanted to, if I were talking with you, I'd be asking, what years were they? Were they kind of pre-adolescence? There's no specific year when our eustachian tubes are like, yeah, they end up becoming kind of oblique. Think of like 35. The percentage or angle can vary, but they're no longer flat, like a 0-degree plane, right? So they become oblique and they drain, but typically by adolescence and puberty is when we would expect that to be happening. So were you over adolescence for those 6 summers? That definitely would stand out to me and would make me say, hey, listen to what I'm about to share next with complications that will show up with eustachian tubes. But if it was kind of younger than adolescence for those 6 years, I'd say that's pretty common. I got them a lot, and it can have to do with, typically is considered just a normal structural, hey, the kids just, their head is still developing. If these ear infections happen during adolescence or later, then it makes it much more likely that allergies or another structural complication was a part of these ear infections, which brings us to complications. Complications in ear drainage. So if it's not kind of like, they'll grow out of it, eustachian tubes, flat to oblique, that's going to happen thing. If it's really bad and there's complications, there's two things I would look at. One is the development of your cranial bones and basically your head. So as already mentioned, our heads go through a lot of changes from birth to adulthood. And there's a lot of different factors that actually play into it. We are not guaranteed to get good cranial development. And some of those things can have to do with something we covered on episode 48 of the Better Belly podcast, which is where I interviewed Madison Scott, who is an orofacial myofunctional therapist. And she works with children with tongue ties and lip ties and mouth breathing and tongue thrusting, and basically helps their heads develop correctly. One of the things that's interesting is that there's been several dentists, and one in particular, I actually didn't look this up before the podcast, so I'm blanking on his name, but there was one dentist in the 1900s who traveled around the world to all these different kind of tribes who were not a part of the developed world and was looking at their dental hygiene. In particular, he was really interested in things like cavities, but also did they have straight teeth? And I don't know why he was interested in this. I'm like, how did he know? He had to travel by boat. I mean, this is before like the internet, right, guys? So he was doing this before the internet, and he was traveling around the world, visiting all these tribes and just checking out their oral health. And he was noticing there were fewer cavities and very few people from these Aborigine tribes and tribes in Africa, all these different things, they had straight teeth. And he's like, what the heck? We are in a developed world and all our people have crooked teeth, and yet these people have straight teeth. What are they doing? What is different? Like, why? You would think everyone would have crooked teeth. And what he found is that is not the case. There are factors that impact our mouth's development, both the top layer, which is attached to bones and our hard palate, and the bottom set of our teeth, which is attached to our jaw. And so we cannot take for granted the fact that how our teeth end up looking and how our mouth is developing, it varies just as much as with the head. It's impacted by our tongue. It's impacted by food we're eating, our breathing patterns, tongue ties, fascial restrictions, all sorts of stuff. And I talked about that in episode 48. So if you're interested in I had eustachian tube problems. Yeah, I know that I had ear infections. Yeah, and I'm about to talk about some other problems and symptoms that come up in children and in adults. If you have poor cranial development, or I guess you could say you had it and now you're kind of stuck with it. And you're not quite stuck, by the way, but you're currently subjected to some of its symptoms. Check out episode 48, and it's titled Got Snoring, Sleep Apnea, TMJ, or Teeth Grinding. You may need an orofacial myofunctional therapist. It's great. So some things that can impact cranial development are going to be tongue and lip ties, poor sucking quality, because sucking as an infant is part of how we actually lift our hard palate and start opening up our sinuses, fascial restrictions in our bodies as children. Were you born with the assist of forceps or a vacuum? That really does a lot of trauma to the cranial bones and to our fascia, and can really impact the development of a child's whole body, let alone specifically their head and eustachian tubes, and then hence leading to ear infections. But some other signs of cranial development that is impaired or dysfunctional in children is going to be mouth breathing, snoring, poor sleep habits, like just difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, restless leg syndrome, fussy eaters, colic problems, latching problems as a baby, headache and migraines as a child, irritability and anger problems, ADD. And that has to do with airway problems and not getting enough oxygen at night. So your brain's you're basically starved of oxygen. for some of your most important developmental hours, which is when you're sleeping. And that will result in some different mood and or learning difficulties, tongue thrusting, and just generally being behind developmental curves. Maybe it's speaking or walking or learning difficulties in school, or seemingly like quote unquote hormonal or mood problems that are going to show up even into adolescence, or growth spurts that are behind, because how you breathe impacts your whole life. It is fascinating. And then even things like recurring sinus infections, because how your head develops impacts how your sinuses develop, how you're breathing. Can you breathe at night? Are you congested? All these things. And then, of course, it's going to impact your eustachian tubes. Some signs of poor cranial development in adults. You're going to have more of a sunken chin or a poorly pronounced chin, sunken and flat cheeks, maybe a crooked nose, tired looking eyes, or maybe like just puffiness around your eyes, facial swelling, or like this puffy face look, which I've had. And actually, I have several of these, and I look back and I had sleep problems. I had restless leg syndrome. I'm like a classic poster child of having poor cranial development, and I had colic, and I had ear infections. And I really wish, I don't blame anyone for this, I really wish my parents knew what craniosacral therapy was, because it probably would have changed my life. It would have changed my anxiety and my depression and just so many things. And I think that's one of the reasons why me getting craniosacral therapy as an adult has impacted me so much, and why I wanted to learn craniosacral therapy, which I'm jumping ahead of myself here. But craniosacral therapy, cat out of the bag, is actually one of the ways you can address these problems, both in children and in adults. But some other signs of poor cranial development in children or in adolescence and adulthood is going to be needing an expander for your mouth, because your tongue is the natural expander of your mouth. But if your tongue isn't resting on the roof of your mouth, then you're not going to get that expansion, and you'll have to manually expand it, which is much more violent, you could say, for the head. And it's better if it's done by the tongue anyways. Sleep difficulties such as insomnia. I already mentioned restless leg syndrome, not waking up feeling rested, difficulty swallowing pills or food in the mouth, getting sinus infections once a year or more. Sinus infections, y'all, are not normal. They are not normal. And people who get them regularly just are like, oh, this is my yearly sinus infection. Red flag. That is a huge red flag that your cranial development is off, and or you probably have chronic inflammation, likely from gut problems. So if you do get chronic sinus problems and you've got acid reflux, bloating, constipation, you name it, GI problem, you likely have this gut sinus connection thing. And I would strongly recommend you check out the other podcast, episode 47, find a craniosacral therapist, and find someone to help you find a functional practitioner to deal with your gut inflammation and problems. Neck and shoulder pain is another big symptom of poor cranial development, because your muscles aren't aligned correctly. And so they're having to strain in ways that they wouldn't for good cranial development, and your head's basically just not on straight. Headaches and migraines, kind of connected to that. Pressure system imbalance of the head due to poor muscular balance connecting to the head, crooked teeth, and there's specific patterns that actually orofacial myofunctional therapists will assess for and say, oh, this crooked teeth pattern, overbite, underbites, all sorts of weird scissoring stuff that they can evaluate and say, this actually shows that your tongue or your jaw or your breathing patterns or your airways, all this stuff are doing XYZ thing. And here's what we can do to actually rehab these muscles and rehab these patterns in your body. So definitely another episode to check out is 48 to learn more about how cranial development impacts both children and us as adults. The solution in both of these cases for children and for adults with kind of snoring problems, sleep problems, ear infections. All this is going to be craniosacral therapy and oral facial myofunctional therapy to retrain the muscles of the head and tongue so you can start to help the head change in development. And for infants, sometimes even a lactation consultant might know how to both do an evaluation and help with some of the retraining, though not all lactation consultants know this. So craniosacral therapy and oral facial myofunctional therapy are going to be great for both adults and children, although the amount that you can alter cranial development is highest in childhood when the cranial bones are still forming. So I'm going to put a link in the show notes for how you can find a craniosacral therapist near you, or you can just go to betterbellytherapies.com/find. And I actually made like a easy step-by-step guide on how to use the find a practitioner near you function on a very specific website and find the best person near you. Not just anyone, but actually like a good high quality person. And then I'll also put a link in the show notes for how you can find an orofacial myofunctional therapist, because they would be the one to assess if you have a tongue tie or an oral tie, any of those things, as well as help retrain the muscles of your head so that they function a little better. It really, really is amazing. And to just give an idea of how much this can impact an adult head, I actually included a link in the show notes that will take you to a photo. It's kind of a picture, but it's a drawing, so not of like a before and after picture. I tried to find a before and after picture and just wasn't had a hard time finding something that I felt like was like a great example. But I have seen before and after pictures of adults who've done orofacial myofunctional therapy with craniosacral therapy to reshape their head, more or less, and it's amazing. This is a picture, and it will show you, it'll kind of point out everything I just verbally said on how your head will look as an adult if you have cranial development that was poor, right? It wasn't the full amount that you were looking for and needing. So go check out that picture if you're like, I'm trying to imagine it, Allison. Does my head look like this? Am I suffering from these things? Go check out that picture. It'll be a link in the show notes. So that's number one with ear infections, especially like ongoing into adulthood, just really intense, but sometimes can even impact you as a child, is do you have these other signs and symptoms that your cranial development was off course? But second, this is where we do get back into allergies, is swelling in the eustachian tube and or the nasopharyngeal region, which is just a fancy term for the nose, sinus, and the back of the throat. Because that eustachian tube connects the ear to the back of the throat through kind of the nose and sinuses. And if there's swelling due to inflammation in the body, so it could be systemic inflammation due to a pathogen or due to food sensitivities, or due to a burdened liver that's now been exposed to pollen because you walked outside, that swelling is going to predispose you to a higher likelihood of ear infection because you cannot get the drainage you need. You need that eustachian tube to drain. And so even if it's at the right angle and your head's, has the right cranial development, if it's everything's swollen, it can't drain right. So this does have to do with allergies. A huge part of our immune system is located in our nasal airways. It's the first line of defense against pollen and dust and bacteria. And like I already mentioned, if the liver's already overwhelmed and not processing, just like whatever you have going on in your body already, again, could be food sensitivities, pathogens, toxins, you kind of get like an immune traffic jam. Your lymphatic pathways get blocked up, your face swells, all this different stuff is going on. And so everything basically just gets stuck up in your head. So this can look like practically, other than just an ear infection, just on a day-to-day basis, chronic postnasal drip, repeat sinus infections, a sense of just having plugged ears and or nose, chronic sinusitis. You might really dislike planes or driving through the mountains due to difficulty getting your ears to balance out to the changing pressures. getting headaches and migraines, having shoulder tension, kind of some things I already listed. And again, I really do a deeper dive on this in episode 47 of the Gut Sinus Connection. I hope I'm not saying that too much, but basically go check that out. If you want to know more about the anatomy and physiology and like specific details behind how this is all super connected, because it's not vague, it's like incredibly specific. So the solution, if you think it's more of a allergy problem, or excuse me, more of an inflammation problem with these ear infections, is to heal the gut and the liver. And yes, you could be born with both of those not doing so great, which is why I kind of talked about childhood factors, in utero factors as you were growing in your mother's womb, all these things that can impact you. So maybe straight out of the gate, coming into the brand new world, you actually are already quite burdened in your body. But if that's the case, you can still undo that. That's the great news. Our bodies are really malleable and you can still heal your body. And so you might be struggling with some health problems. I'm guessing you are, right? If you sent in that question and you've been listening to this podcast. And so you can still heal your gut. You can heal your liver. With my clients, I use our 9-step Better Belly system to help you systematically address your bloating, constipation, and liver toxicity one step at a time, not missing a single thing. And it's part of how our clients get such amazing results, because it's not just like haphazard, let me try this one thing and that one thing, but it's this step-by-step, 9-step proven method to help that we use on all of our clients and all our testimonials on this podcast to help them get results. If you want to know more about our Better Belly system and how you can work with us, you can head to betterbellytherapies.com/foundations or click the link in the show notes to learn about our signature program, the Foundations program, and how you can work with us. So, but to end our podcast episode, I just want to leave you guys with 3 questions. If you're like, how do I distill all this information, Allison, and kind of ask myself this question. So, number 1, just ask yourself, when did your allergies start? Was it like, as early as you can remember, age 5, age 10, age 15? And kind of subsequent to that, have your allergies gotten worse or better over your lifetime? That can suggest whether or not you have increased your efficiency and health of your gut, decreased it, if your liver's more burdened or less burdened. And similarly, has your gut health gotten better or worse over your lifetime? And is there a correlation you see with that with your allergies, whether you had childhood allergies or not? What do you know about your childhood upbringing? And that gets back to some of the questions or some of the things I was bringing up at the beginning of the episode. Were you a fussy eater? Were you colicky? Did you have a hard time breastfeeding or even bottle feeding, aka like you had a hard time sucking, which would be connected to cranial development and possibly tongue ties? Did you have to go through any rounds of antibiotics for any reason? Did your mother go through any rounds of antibiotics while you were in the womb? Were you born vaginally or through cesarean? Again, if you don't know the answer to these questions, if you have a parent or a guardian that you can ask who might know the answers, this would be a great time to ask. I know my parents have told me, I don't know why, but just kind of throughout my life, my mom would be like, you were so colicky. And sometimes we hear these stories, sometimes we don't. And you can just ask. This is, again, not about shaming or blaming our parents or guardians. And again, we can't necessarily change exactly what happened, but it can create the sense of wholeness of like, hey, my health story makes sense to me. I'm one full unit, and I'm not disjointed into like, I'm just sicker than all the other kids, or I got the short end of the stick. Like, there's reasons that these things happen to people. And if you are curious about your whole health story, getting the childhood and infanthood story is a great addition to understanding yourself as a whole human being and your health as kind of one story. And then the third question to ask yourself is, do you have any signs of poor cranial development that I talked about, either as a child or as an adult? I already mentioned, like, I totally had so many of these symptoms that as I write them down and as I came across them in my studies for craniosacral therapy and learning more about orofacial malofunctional therapy, I was like, oh my gosh, this is me. And I have gut health problems on top of symptoms with my liver, on top of sinus stuff and sleep problems, that so much of this has resolved in my life. And it explains why craniosacral therapy was so helpful to me, why it's so helpful to my clients, why getting rid of food sensitivities and healing the liver and really looking at gut pathogens, all these different things create this one experience of just having a healthier body, of having more energy, of having less discomfort in our body. And so I massively improved after getting craniosacral therapy and visceral manipulation, and I did muscle retraining with a chiropractor for my head and neck, massively changed my life. And then many of my clients, or I'd say several of my clients, have seen my friend and colleague Madison, who has evaluated them and found tongue ties, and their health also was massively changed by addressing the tongue tie and muscular imbalance in their life. And so I actually had no tongue tie. I had Madison look at it. She said I had no tongue tie, but I did check, and I recommend you do too if you have any of these signs, either past or present, of poor cranial development. All right, so that wraps us up for our first episode of Ask Allison. I would love to be doing these episodes once a month or once every other month. And so if you have a question, it is super simple. To submit it, you just go to betterbellytherapies.com/Ask Allison or click the link in the show notes. And you are going to just see a little button. You can click record and ask your question. You can leave your name and or email, or you can ask completely anonymously. It's up to you. And you may get your question featured on this podcast and get my thoughts directly into your burning question. I really enjoyed today's podcast episode, and I really love hearing from you guys, hearing what's on your mind, hearing what questions you haven't had answered. It honestly makes it more fun for me. And I don't give free advice or anything through DMs or any of that. So if you've ever wanted to ask me a question, but you're like, but like, how do I ask her? Now is the perfect time. So just go to betterbellytherapies.com/Ask Allison, click record. I will get a message. I'll get to review your question, and you may end up on the Better Belly podcast. Now, to end our show, if you love this episode, we have even more coming down the line. Subscribe so you never miss a beat. And if you thought of a friend while you were listening to this episode, I encourage you to take a screenshot and send it to that friend. I cannot count how many times when I tell someone I'm a gut health therapist, they say, "Oh, I know someone who needs you." So send that friend a love note to their gut and do us a favor and pass this podcast along to them. Other ways you can support us is by leaving a rating and review. And I just want to give a shout out to Nico W., who recently left us a podcast review. He said, "Awesome. This podcast has been a ray of hope. Allison has great energy, asks good questions, and dives deeply into so many things that affect gut health that I didn't even know about. I've learned a lot and continue to do so." Thanks, Nico, for your review and I'm encouraged and just helping others find this podcast and know that this is great content. I am so glad that you are learning so much. And other ways you can stay in the conversation with us is by following us on Instagram and Facebook at Better Belly Therapies. I love connecting with our listeners there, and I hope to get to see you and talk with you there as well. In the meantime, I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. We'll see you next week.